Hello, welcome to a special Q&A recording of MLK FBI, one of the 50 official selection titles at the 45th Toronto International Film Festival. This film plays as part of TIFF Docs, which is generously sponsored by A&E Indie Films. My name is Tom Powers, and I'm TIFF's documentary programmer, celebrating my 15th year at the festival. I'm honored to be here with the film's director, Sam Pollard, who's joining me from his home in Greenwich Village, New York City. Thank you to our audience for being a part of TIFF during these unprecedented times. We are grateful for your support to keep TIFF going for years to come. This film is eligible for the People's Choice Award. You can vote for your favorite films at tiff.net/vote. Sam, it's great to have you here. You were last at TIFF in 2017 with your film about Sammy Davis Jr. We're pleased to have you back, even under these very strange circumstances.
It is a pleasure, Tom, to be back at TIFF, and it's always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you.
Oh, I enjoyed that. So you've worked on so many projects that deal with civil rights in the U.S. You've directed episodes of Eyes on the Prize. You made the film Slavery by Another Name. And there's no shortage of projects in the world about Martin Luther King Jr. So what were you hoping to do fresh with this one?
Well, you know, Ben Hadeen, who's the producer of the film, him and I had worked together on the previous film, Two Trains Running. And after we finished that film, he had read this book by David Garrow that looked at Dr. King and his relationship, you know, with a gentleman named Stanley Levinson, who had been a former communist who had been surveilled by the FBI. So he thought that would be another film that we could tackle, looking at King from a different perspective, how the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover were basically trying to discredit Dr. King and his role in the civil rights struggle. And they were going to go by it through any means necessary. You know, they were bugging his colleagues, they bugged his house, they did wiretaps, they did anything they could to really discredit Dr. King. So we thought this was another way to look at Dr. King and how important he was to the movement, and the links the FBI would go to discredit him. So basically, about 2 years ago, we started trying to raise funds for the film, and we didn't get much love. But finally, a year and a half ago, Synetic came on board, was able to. They're repping us. They were able to find some funders who supported the project and the concept. So we went out and shot. Basically, we had done the original interview with Dave Garrow 2 years ago, and then we did a second interview with Dave, and then we did about 4 or 5 other interviews in the summer of 2019 and the fall of 2019, and we started editing like in November of 2019. So this was pretty fast turnaround, to do this project. But for what you were saying, as you said, I have a long legacy of doing things like Eyes on the Prize, The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow, Slavery by Another Name. And it's always been important for me to really dig into the struggle, the civil rights struggle, and the African-American experience in America.
Well, so what's so interesting about this is that often when we're seeing Martin Luther King portrayed, we're understandably looking through the perspective of his heroism. And what you get in this film, what I took away from this film, is this different lens, this lens of seeing him through the eyes of the FBI, without the hindsight of history that we are normally thinking about Dr. King, that is framing him really as a villain instead of the hero that we think of him today. Can you talk about trying to get into that mindset of 1960s J. Edgar Hoover?
Well, it's important to kind of remember that Dr. King was looked upon by men, by J. Edgar Hoover as one of the most, notorious men in the face of the earth. He was afraid. A lot of people, most of America was afraid of what was happening in the 50s and the 60s with the civil rights movement. They felt that people like King and Fred Shuttlesworth and Ralph Abernathy, and then later the Black Panther Party, they were going to, destabilize what it meant to be an American. So they were fearful of him. And what's also fascinating, when you go back and look at this history, there's a section in the film where you realize that Hoover was really a hero to many people in America at this time. Not how we see him today, but back then he was a torchbearer for, justice in the American way. And here was King, who he saw as an upstart, who was getting all this love getting the Nobel Peace Prize and saying, this guy should not be getting all this respect, shouldn't be getting all these accolades, and we need to figure out how to take him down. First, they tried to say he was a communist because he had Stanley Levinson, who was working for him, who adored Dr. King, who had been a former communist. And then when they realized that he was not a monogamous man, they wanted to really see if they could take him down by showing that, even though he was a minister, he was having, all these relationships with other women. So they were going to go to any lengths to do the King. So it's an amazing sort of look at history, how this organization and Edgar Hoover and Sullivan were trying to figure out every step of the way in the 60s, up until his assassination, how to really disembowel Dr. King.
Yeah. In the film, you hear historians wrestling with the question of what should we do with these surveillance tapes and information that the FBI captured of Martin Luther King, and what should we do with tapes that are going to become available in the future? And I wonder how you personally think about that question.
My reaction to that question is that I think by this time, we're here in 2021, everyone knows King was not an angel. He was a human being. He had flaws. But what he was doing in terms of helping Black people, trying to integrate America, is iconic and powerful. So even though these tapes will come out, you have to understand that these tapes and the files that were written about Dr. King always have to be looked at with a grain of salt, because the FBI had an agenda. They had an agenda. So you got to be careful. Everything that they wrote down, it was just what they thought they heard, what they wanted to hear in terms of King's involvement in another room, another hotel room that they were bugging. So you always have to take all these things with a grain of salt, because the thing that's always understandable to me, the history is in the eye of those who have the power, So we have to be careful to say, okay, let's look at this and let's see what they were trying to do and what they may not have really wanted to uncover and deal with in terms of Dr. King.
Well, one of the challenges that some filmmakers have had trying to do work about Martin Luther King is that the King estate is, very historically, famously controlling of his words. I think of Ava DuVernay when she was making Selma, and she had to rewrite King's speeches because she wasn't allowed to use the originals. I wonder, when you were doing this project, did you face any constraints about what you could use and that you wanted to and maybe were blocked from?
Well, first of all, we have not shown this film to the King family, and so we're expecting, if they react, they'll react to it. But with lots of documentaries, as you well know, we basically made sure that we figured out how to have a fair use component to the documentary. So there's certain things, certain speeches that we could only use a certain amount of time, use for a certain amount of time, because they would, wouldn't be able to use it under fair use, applications. So, it's always sort of tricky with these films. When we were doing Eyes on the Prize and we wanted to sort of, redistribute the Eyes show that had Dr. King, Black side had a lot of issues with the King family. They can be difficult. We'll see, but the family is not exactly a united family, so we may not catch any brickbat, but who knows? But we're ready for it. We're ready for it. We don't think that we've done anything that is a disservice to the King family or Dr. King's legacy. I don't think you'll walk away saying, no, I won't have the same amount of respect for Dr. King that I've had before. You always will, because all you have to do is look at his "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington. That's iconic. Just look at his speech the night before he was assassinated. That's iconic. This man was one of the most powerful people in American history.
It was really striking to me to hear your interview with former FBI Director James Comey, who describes this as the darkest period of the Bureau's history. And that's saying a lot, considering the Bureau's history. I'm wondering, which of the interviews that you did were most illuminating for you?
For me, it's always Dave Garrow. I find Dave Garrow, I've known Dave Garrow since I worked on Eyes 2 back in 1987, 88. I find him to be a fascinating, complicated man, and I had some issues with him even back with Eyes, and I still do, but I think he does his homework, and I respect him for that. And he's pretty thorough. So I found him the most interesting interview. And probably the second one that was most interesting to me was Andy Young, particularly when I asked him about James Earl Ray. And his response was, I don't think James Earl Ray had anything to do with the assassination of King. I'm not going to say anything about it. I mean, he's got a lot of things inside that he doesn't really want to look at. Even when we asked him about James Harrison, who was an informant for the FBI, he says he didn't want to talk. He didn't want to say his name. I mean, if he ever writes a real tell-all book about his time with King and SCLC, it'll be something.
I want to ask you about David Garrow's books. I read his massive biography of Martin Luther King a few years ago. Yeah. And one of the things that struck me about that is the kind of veil that was drawn across King's extramarital affairs. Every time you get to one of those sections, it gets very vague. He's noting that it happened, but I contrast it to the history around John F. Kennedy, where we know a lot more about his private life, and you can ask, why do we need to know about the private lives of these movement figures or political figures? But I wonder, what you think is worth knowing or not knowing about the private lives of a figure like Martin Luther King.
Well, for me, quite honestly, Tom, I don't really need to know anything about his private life. I don't really care what he did in his private life. I mean, all of us have our own sort of personal things in the closet that we want people to talk about or reveal. I mean, to me, it doesn't dissuade or take away from who he was and how important he was to the movement and to, the impact he had on American history in the 50s and the 60s. So, it's a fascinating thing that this back in the 60s, men like King, JFK, and others, they had very, very intense and complex private lives, but the press didn't go for them, go after them in those days. The world's changed a lot. Quite honestly, I'm not sure how much it's changed because we know a lot about Trump's private life, but it doesn't seem to matter. So I don't really care about his private life. And the reality is that most of the people who were probably involved with King back then, that were involved in his extramarital affairs, they're all dead. Everybody's dead. So there's nobody to tell us anything. I mean, I think that in some ways, Garrow's sort of philosophy's changed a little since he wrote that book a long time ago, So I think he's looking a little more deeply into his private life than I thought he probably ever did with those earlier books. That's my opinion.
So when I watched MLK FBI this summer, it was against the backdrop of street protests and people raising new suspicions about surveillance and infiltrators in grassroots movements. How do you think this film speaks to our current times?
I think in a sad way, it speaks to our current times. So it's so relevant. It is so relevant, in some ways very tragic, that here we are in 2021, and America is still going through the same kind of stuff that happened with King back in the 60s. This notion that people are being surveilled, the notion that in the film, as when LBJ is talking to Edgar Hoover, concerned that people like King are causing these riots in the cities. I mean, you're hearing the same kind of dog whistle dialogue with the Trump administration. So it's sort of sad to me that you think that we've learned something in America, but it just gets repeated and repeated. The fear of communism. All these things are just, that King is to the left. All these things are like, what? The world is still going through this stuff in 2021? It's kind of very tragic to me, as I get to my elderly years. It's sort of tragic that you would think that America would have grown a little, but it hasn't.
Sam, 3 times you've said 2021, and I think you must just be projecting yourself into next year. I can understand.
It's 2020. 2020. Right.
I get that you want to get out of 2020. We all want to get out of 2020.
Yeah, 2020. I'm sorry, 2020.
So, you're a student of history and of citizens movements, and I wonder what stands out to you about, what we're living through right now in 2020, the events of the summer.
There's 3 things that stand out to me. The death of George Floyd and the impact it's had, not only in America, but in the world, how it just really galvanized people all over the world. That to me is like an amazing thing, I thought. The second thing that's really sort of emboldened me and challenged me is the fact that for this time around, for me, Tom, this election cycle coming up, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris has excited me more than when Hillary ran in 2016. And I'm so sick and tired of listening to Trump or hearing about Trump. I want a breath of fresh air. And I'm when Kamala, came and did the thing with Biden last week, and I watched it, I got excited. And for me, a cynical New Yorker, that's a revelation. I was excited. I said, okay, now maybe there's some hope. Maybe there's some hope. And last night I spent, which I really rarely ever do during these election cycles, Tom, I spent my 2 hours watching the DNC convention. I'm going to do it tonight. I'm going to do it tomorrow night. Usually I don't do it, but now I'm going to do it. I've donated. I'm supporting this candidate's, this run, because I want Trump out.
Well, for context for our viewers, Sam and I are recording this conversation on August 18th. People will be watching it in September. Who knows what will happen between now and then. If you want to hear more from Sam, he's going to be speaking at TIFF's industry conference online in a dialogue with the filmmaker Shala Lynch. They worked together many years ago on her film Chisholm 72 about Shirley Chisholm. And that conversation will be available live to TIFF industry delegates. And the recording will be available after September 14th on Bell Digital Cinema. Sam, we're so proud to be showing this film to its first audience at TIFF. We love having you in Toronto when we can have you in Toronto. And this is the next best thing, having you join us here. So thanks very much.
My pleasure, Tom.